Good evening. Welcome to Chasing the Facts. I'm Sam Chase, your host. And our guest this evening is Dr. Glenn Thoren. Glenn, thank you for being here. And we are going to depart a little bit from our usual format this evening because we've had a situation come up in the town of Chelmsford which could possibly be a problematic political situation. And I thought what we would do this evening is examine that and examine some of the background information that leads up to that eventuality. And the reason I've asked Glenn to be with us this evening is because Glenn is, I believe, the unofficial political commentator for Chelmsford TeleMedia. And he also has probably about the best knowledge of anybody in town relative to the charter operation of the town, having served now on 2 charter review committees. So let's, with that introduction, let's begin the show, and I'm going to set the stage a little bit, and then we're going to have a discussion. On January 30th, this past week, the Lowell Sun published an article, and the headline of the article was, "Select Board Doesn't Renew Cohen's Contract." Now, Paul Cohen is Chelmsford's town manager, I'm sure, as most of our viewing audience knows. From there on, the article goes in to describe what happened that evening, which essentially was that on the Select Board's agenda for that evening, they had an agenda item which was to discuss the continuation of the town manager's employment contract, which is due to expire on June 30th of this year. At that point, the board adjourned to executive session to return to open session, and they had a discussion. The board then returned to open session and adjourned the open session because they decided to take no action on the agenda item, which was the discussion of the town manager's contract status going forward. So that's what's happened, and as a result of this article, a number of folks in town have concluded that the board's action or inaction, if you want to call it that, really should be interpreted to mean that the board does not want the town manager to continue in office, okay? And that's what many people have concluded by reading this, even though the article doesn't say that, that has been the conclusion. So that's the backdrop of what we're going to discuss tonight. What does all this mean? What is the background? What is the relationship that the town manager has to the Board of Selectmen? What is the responsibility of the Board of Selectmen in terms of continuing a town manager's employment? So with that as a backdrop, I'm going to turn over to Glenn now and ask him, before we get into the meat of the discussion, is there anything else that we should add to the preliminaries?
Well, I think a couple of things, because there's been a lot of activity around town concerning people's opinions about Paul Cohen. When they read that article and they interpreted it as a possible removal of Paul Cohen, they started taking some action, including collecting signatures. Mm-hmm. But I want to point out in the article there's some things that we know, there's some things that we clearly don't know. A lot of the discussion that took place in executive session, or all of the discussion that took place in the executive session, is privileged, it's private. And selectmen...
Meaning that the public is not supposed to know until
right.
such time as the board formally releases the minutes of the executive session.
Right, and I've talked with a few of the selectmen, and what I've ascertained was basically there's a discussion ongoing, and one of the selectmen was very protective of the executive meeting discussions, said, the only thing I could tell you is what Pat Woj said when we left the executive session, was that no decision has been made. So the only fact that we're working with right now is that no decision has been made. And people talk about there was a vote, there wasn't a vote. If there was a vote, you would know that there was a vote because that would have to be reported out and what the results of the vote were. So what we don't know is what the discussion was in the executive session.
Correct.
I will add one thing, and it's very troubling that in the Lowell Sun this came up so quickly about some of the details that were probably discussed in the executive session that something leaked from the executive session, and that should never happen. So I'm going to leave it to the select board to talk to the members and determine who talked to anybody about this, because it's a breach of ethics. It's probably a breach of etiquette to release any information from the executive session that ends up in the newspaper. That's extremely troubling. I know that it probably bothered you a lot as a one-time selectman.
It absolutely bothered me, and it still bothers me. And,
As it should.
And we'll just leave it. We'll just leave it there. I mean, I think you've described that very adequately. What I'd like to do now is just take maybe a few minutes to kind of put out some information to the general public as to what our charter specifies in terms of how our local government is structured, specifically as it relates to the powers and duties of the Board of Selectmen and the powers and duties of the town manager. So we've got some PowerPoint slides. So we have the first slide. And essentially what we're saying here is that the town of Chelmsford is governed by a municipal charter as defined in Massachusetts general law. And the charter is essentially the Constitution of Chelmsford. It establishes and defines the structure, tells you what the offices are and who the officials are that occupy those offices, and it generally defines the scope of power and duty that the folks have that run the government. So if we could have slide number 2, please. Charter section 3.2 talks about the power and the scope and span of control, if you will, that the Board of Selectmen has. And the two takeaways here you see bolded in the red. First is that the Board of Selectmen is the chief policy-making agency of the town. They make the policy. The town manager does not make policy. He cannot make policy under the terms of our charter. The second bold comes after a section that says that the selectmen have all the powers and duties that are assigned to them by the state law, any delegation under this charter or any bylaw or action of town meeting, except those powers granted to the town manager under this charter. So what that means is, if there are specific powers and duties that are specified for the town manager, what that section means is the selectmen cannot act in those areas. That's what that means.
Right, the charter also talks about them not acting in those
Correct.
areas. And
Correct.
things like setting the tax rate is something that's specifically allowed to the selectmen and only the selectmen to do.
The town manager, even though he gets blamed sometimes for the tax rate by the folks in town, town manager has absolutely nothing to do with setting the tax rate. To your point, that is an area that is reserved exclusively for the selectmen. Only they can do that function. So that's the point of that. Next slide. Now, what qualifies a town manager? And as people know me, that I do my presentations, I don't read slides. I make the assumption that everybody can read. So those are set there for you. The general requirements that the charter requires of the town manager, what he can and cannot do. So the town manager is responsible for making all appointments under the charter. Anybody who works in town government except school department employees. The town manager has nothing to do with that operation. That's managed separately by the school committee and the school superintendent. But the town manager appoints all department heads, police chief, fire chief, DPW chief, folks like that, town clerk and so forth. And also appoints all of the boards in town, the volunteer boards, that are not elected, okay?
And you and I have served on many of
Correct.
those over the years.
Correct. Now, the selectmen do have to approve the town manager appointments. And they have 30 days to do that. If they don't do it, then the folks that are appointed take office automatically. The selectmen are not supposed to micromanage that process. Their role really is limited to making sure that the town manager brings forth a suitable candidate. And if the candidate is qualified and suitable, then the expectation is they'll appoint him. They're not supposed to second-guess the town manager in terms of, is this really the best person?
They may have done that in the past, but honestly, I cannot remember a case when that's happened.
No, they've always adhered to that premise. I don't ever remember.
I'm assuming your memory's better than mine.
Well, actually, and I served on the board for a while, and that's what we used to do. So if we can have the next slide. So the town manager is, in fact, the chief administrative officer of the town, does not make policy, and he is responsible to the board for the proper operation of the town. And he is responsible for supervising all of that activity and also coordinating the activities between the select board and other town boards as required. Next slide, please. Now, this is where I think we want to get into our discussion a little bit, Glenn. We did a charter review in 2016 and 2017, and we made a number of recommendations to the Board of Selectmen for changing the charter. We also wrote several advisories to the board. The advisories were not recommendations for charter change. They were simply our opinion as we went through the process and discovered certain things and looked at the relationships and so forth. Advice, basically, that we were giving the Board of Selectmen. And one of the things that we did was we talked about, in an advisory to the board, we talked about the separation of powers between the town manager and the Board of Selectmen and what the appropriate relationship was. We highlighted that. And then we made some suggestions. So if we could have the last slide, and I'm going to let Glenn address these.
So one of the things that the Charter Review Committee thought was very important is to set out a framework. Once we have the Constitution, as you've described it previously, that sets the boundaries of responsibility and capabilities of the selectmen and the town manager. There is that interface between selectmen and town manager, because selectmen change, new people run for office, people that are elected to office, their opinions on how things might be done in the town change. And they try to develop consensus within their board about the policy for the town. But also when they do that, it's important for them to discuss their thought processes, their direction, and what they're trying to do, accomplish in the policy with the town manager, because it really is an interesting team. One person is going to take care of all the day-to-day business execution, the budgeting, the complexities of running a town of this size, and the other team is going to take the select board. Got to get used to that term.
Well, we're old. It's going to be tough.
Yeah, it's going to be tough.
We'll really make the attempt.
I'm working on
Yep,
it.
absolutely.
So the select board has to look at the larger picture of, how does the town operate? And the town operates through the town manager into the departments that he runs, the DPW and all the people in the clerk's office and everything else. How does a town operate in executing what they have for policy decisions? So now it requires, and as you've managed people and I have, it requires that the two, town manager and the Board of Selectmen, have a process of communicating that allows them to understand better what the policies are that they're trying to promote, and also should frequently review the activities of the town manager in executing that policy. So on this slide, you can see that we identified as the Charter Review Committee substantive discussions that occur transparently and on a regular basis, and some of those probably happen in the meetings of the Select Board, but it's an area that everybody knows that a good working machine has constant communications. There will always be disagreements on issues, whether it's an individual, a couple of individuals on the Select Board, or the town managers, and I can't execute that policy in a way you'd like me to. Here's what I propose. But the key to success is having this back and forth on a regular basis. And the town manager does that with the select board, and it's reflected in his reviews. So in order to have the periodic reviews with the town manager and the Board of Selectmen, it requires active, aggressive, open communications. If an issue exists that need to be discussed and dealt with, you deal with it. And many times we've seen in industry and business when something goes awry, it's because people are not talking to each other. And one or the other may hold a strong opinion, and almost everything that we've seen in our careers, there is neutral ground. There is a place where both parties may be a little bit unhappy with the result, but there's a place to get to that ends up in progress for the town and continuing progress for things that we love about the town, but doesn't cause division, so that, you know, if the discussions you see in the newspaper are even an inkling of what might be going on, where a radical change is going to be made. So I'm not sure, I'm not comfortable that, you know, these things that we recommended to the board and to the town manager are something that has been actively exploited to get them on the same page. That's a concern of mine, and it should be a concern of everybody in the town. Two things take place, that can happen. They can work out whatever issues may be on the table right now and move forward. And I think applying these communication techniques so that they're not working at cross purposes become key to success. Or, the town manager gets removed, which could have a tremendous ripple effect, because the departments he's created, the leadership he's selected, the way the town is run is in large part related to the way he as a town manager interacts with his boards and subordinates. So what some people don't realize, and those in business that have had organizations realize, if you do precipitous changes, there are a lot of unintended consequences that could be very damaging to the enterprise. And none of us want that, because Chelmsford has come a long way. I've been here well over 30 years. People have been here much longer than I have. But they've seen what Chelmsford was, what we've become, our recovery from our financial situation, which was going downhill rapidly before this town manager arrived, the recovery of buildings that we think are important to our history, the support for the public schools, the additional money that's come in through other ways to the public school system. So the town as a whole is either benefiting from or may become victim of poor communications.
Yes, and I recall that in our charter review discussion of this particular point, we spent quite a bit of time on this, and I believe we had unanimous consent by all members of the committee that we should maybe go outside of our scope a little bit and provide this kind of an advisory
We did.
To the board. And I share your concern. I'm not really sure whether they have taken this to heart. And if my expectation is, and because of course I know the way we did things when I was on the Board of Selectmen, we actually established a formal line of communication with the manager when I was chair. I had a standing appointment with him every Friday afternoon.
Did you find that helpful?
And yes, and it was for a half an hour. That's what we slotted. And we made it for 5 o'clock so it wouldn't interfere with his normal work day. And of course, I was still working at the time and wouldn't interfere with my working day. More often than not, those sessions lasted a lot longer than a half an hour. There were many times that I was there well past 6 o'clock. And that was once a week a formal discussion. And there may not have been anything particularly pressing at the time. It didn't matter. I think, and I never really discussed it with Paul, I never asked him really, well, how do you feel about these things? Because I really didn't care how he felt. I was chairman of the Board of Selectmen, and this was my role. And I, as chairman of the board, I thought I had the right and the obligation to have that formal conversation with him every week. And he was fine with that, okay? So we never really said, do you really think this is working? I thought it was working. And it did work. And I think that avoided a lot of misunderstanding. Now, that's just the formal aspect of it. That doesn't say that you don't have other chances when you sit down and dialogue. And it's not only the chairman. There are 4 other members of that board. They should feel free on their own time to schedule time with Paul. And my experience is that the town manager has always been very good about accommodating that situation. So hopefully, going forward, they'll consider this, and if it's not being done now, they'll consider doing this on a going forward basis.
So one of the things that a lot of people are unaware of, because they're not in town hall, they don't They don't live through the processes that go on all day long. This is a very complex town. There's a lot of things that need to be done, from finance to construction to support for the schools, and also I'm sure that there are some personnel issues that need to be dealt with from time to time. It's a complex job. Now, as a manager or an administrator, generally all the details of how do you make your organization work on a day-to-day basis, they're not shared. I mean, you just do it, and you take care of the business at hand. If there are, what we're trying to say here is, if there are issues that an individual or collectively the board has with what's going on in town, that they say, I don't understand how this is being done. This doesn't look right to me. Those shouldn't be internalized. Those should be externalized in as soon as possible, meeting with the town manager to say, okay, explain to us what's going on. And if there's a continued divergence of opinion, then a larger explanation, maybe a public discussion at a selectmen's meeting, would be appropriate, so that the townspeople can hear what's going on too, because we're part of this solution. Is, everybody wins or loses depending on how well the town is run.
Correct, and it should never be a situation where you gather for a meeting on a Monday night and either party is surprised by the discussion. And you don't want a situation where the town manager all of a sudden, selectman says something, and where did that come from? And the reverse is true. I mean, the selectman should never be ambushed by the town manager, okay? So that's what this is all relating to. Selectmen set policy, and the selectmen should talk to the town manager frequently enough so that they're satisfied that he understands the flow of the policy through his administrative actions, and that's really what.
So two people I know fairly well is you and ex-selectman Bill Dalton, and you both had the same phrase. I'll keep reminding you of things you've said to me in the past.
I've probably forgotten, but go ahead.
No, it's just what you already said. I don't like surprises.
Nope.
You said it,
nope.
And he said it, and everybody that heard you say it understood why. Because being blindsided by something is not the way a good working team operates. No.
So, that's something that we always felt very strongly about. Now, just getting back to the article a little bit, one other thing in the article, which I think we need to discuss in terms of just getting the information out to the public so they understand how these things work. The discussion in the article was the continuation of Paul Cohen's employment contract, which is a 3-year contract and it expires on June 30th. So if the selectmen choose not to renew his contract, then on July 1st, Mr. Cohen has no employment contract. But that does not mean he is no longer an employee of the town.
Correct.
And I've had calls from people in the last week, and they've asked about this. And the answer is that the employment agreement is separate from the term of office. And the term of office mechanism is specified in the charter. And what happens is the Board of Selectmen hire the town manager on a supermajority vote, 4/5 vote, for an indefinite term. Now, the word indefinite means undefined. So what that means is it goes on forever until somebody stops it. And it can be stopped at any time under our charter for no reason. There is nothing in the charter that says you may only remove a town manager for cause. It doesn't say that.
Nope.
The charter is silent on that. So if 4 select people get together and just decide they don't want a town manager, they can take that vote. But under the charter, that's not
the whole story.
They cannot proceed directly to that. What they have to do, if the selectmen think that they want to remove the town manager, what they have to do under the terms of our charter is they have to adopt a preliminary resolution of removal. That takes a 3/5 vote. So they can do that with a simple majority. Mm-hmm. And then that preliminary resolution has to set forth the reasons for why they want to terminate him. So it has to be very specific. This is why we want to release you. And that has to be given to the town manager right away. And then the town manager can request a public hearing in writing. And if the town manager does that, then the selectmen have to have the public hearing. And then at the conclusion of the public hearing, the selectmen then take another vote. And if they still at that point want to remove him, it takes a 4-to-1 vote to do that. So that's the process. So the reason we're talking about this is because we don't want people to have the impression that simply by not renewing his contract, they have in effect removed the town manager, because at least in my interpretation, and I assume yours, that is not true. They're separate. The employment agreement is basically a salary, benefits, and a severance agreement.
Right, and sometimes, and this is not uncommon, that if there are some discussions that are taking place about performance and such, and Paul's had reviews for, well over a decade. I've generally been following the quality of his reviews, and they've been very good. So,
including the last one.
Yes, including the last one. So if there is something that has come up that is so severe and so important that it might lead to his no longer being the town manager, then this process will reveal exactly what that is.
That's the intent, correct.
And the thing that's kind of strange here is that other than that meeting that would be held at the town manager's request, if you get to that point, the public doesn't generally have a process to input to the Board of Selectmen. So one of the things that's troubling by this article is that it generally reveals something's going on. There may be a problem here, and people don't know what it is. And so I think it would be a benefit, and I'm not making this a legal request, but I think just an ethical request, that the Board of Selectmen make some statement as to whether they're in a process of negotiating with Paul, of looking at a particular issue, and having trouble deciding what to do next. People need to know that, because they have no idea what's going on. And generally in a town, even though we have all these rules and regulations that are in the charter, rumors get started, and rumors are always going to be the worst outcome. This is what might happen. So for clarity and transparency to the town, it would be beneficial to let people know where the board is in discussions. It could be they're negotiating. It could be something else. It could be they need a decision from a third party about something that's happened. I don't know. So that's an important piece.
I think you're absolutely right. And my experience is that when there is a vacuum of information, people tend to fill that vacuum, and they may fill it with the most negative of thoughts.
With their imagination.
With their imaginations, or in some cases, wishful thinking and so forth. So I think information is critical. Now, on that same thought, and we have about a minute and a half left here for our discussion, do you think that the selectmen at this point could put out a suitable statement that would not conflict with the confidentiality of the executive session?
I'm sure any of the selectmen or you and I could write such a suitable statement to let the public know where they are in either a discussion or a process. And you don't have to reveal any of the details, but you can let people know what trajectory you're on. And the town should feel free to contact any of the selectmen, and positive or negative, let them know what they think about the town manager.
Absolutely, and I think that's the correct way to go. And it is a little dispiriting for me, I think, to have to look at some of these discussions on social media.
It's annoying.
Because, again, a lot of it is speculation. A lot of it is, I don't know what it is. But when we're talking about issues this serious that have potential important ramifications for the town, my only request of our citizens is that they keep a cool head. They try not to let their emotions run away with them. They try to wait for the facts for a reasonable amount of time. And then the corollary to that is hopefully the selectmen will address this issue in the very near future, and so that we can get back on track and get on with the proper administration of the town. Thank you very much, Glenn, for being a guest.
Glad to be here. Thanks for the
And
invitation.
we'll be here in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.